Ever find yourself just completely bombarded with information?
Yeah.
Like trying to absorb everything from a tough textbook chapter or maybe remembering all the details of a friend's crazy weekend. It's pretty amazing how our brains handle the constant flood of info coming at us every single day.
Yeah, it's a nonstop process.
Yeah.
And that's actually exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to explore what's called the information processing approach. It's basically a way to understand the nuts and bolts of how our minds work, how we learn, remember, and make sense of the world. It's kind of like a user manual for your brain.
I love that, a user manual. And you, our amazing listeners, sent in some seriously interesting stuff on this. So our mission today is to sift through all those resources and try to distill the key takeaways about how this whole system of information processing develops.
Right. And we'll be looking at how those cognitive functions, things like attention, memory, thinking, they all kind of weave together as we grow from those early years all the way into adulthood.
So it's a journey through the lifespan of our cognitive abilities.
Precisely. And we'll cover everything from the very basics of how we encode information, which is like getting it into our system, to the more complex stuff like critical thinking and, get this, metacognition.
Metacognition, that sounds pretty intense.
It is, but in simple terms, it's basically thinking about thinking, becoming aware of your own mental processes. It's kind of like having an inner observer in your brain.
Okay, that makes more sense. I'm ready for some serious mind-blowing moments here because we've got a lot to unpack. But don't worry, we'll keep things clear, concise, and engaging. So first things first, let's demystify the information processing approach itself. What exactly is it?
So at its core, the information processing approach examines how we take in information, how we work with it, manipulate it, how we monitor our own understanding, and how we actually develop strategies to handle all that incoming info. One of the big names in this field is Robert Siegler, and his work really highlights how our minds don't just passively absorb information, we actively process and interact with it.
So it's not just receiving information, it's like doing something with it.
Exactly, and this was a major shift from older psychological theories like behaviorism, which mainly focused on outward behavior, like the stimulus and response. The information processing approach really puts the emphasis on the mental steps that are happening in between. And, it aligns with other cognitive theories like those from Piaget and Vygotsky, who also focused on how we think.
Right, right. I remember reading about a comparison to computers, like the brain is a computer. How does that analogy work?
Right. Cognitive psychologists often use the computer as a metaphor to help visualize this whole process. So think of it like this. The brain is like the computer's hardware, right? It's the physical structure. And then all our cognitive functions like thoughts, memories, attention, that's the software. Those are the programs that are running. And then our senses, they're the input devices, taking in info from the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see the parallels here.
Yeah, and then this information gets processed and stored in our memory. It's like saving a file in your computer. And when we need it, we retrieve it, and that's the output. Figure 1 in your sources actually illustrates this whole model pretty well.
It's a really neat way to picture it. But I remember the sources also saying there are limitations to that analogy, right? Like our brains aren't exactly like computers.
Definitely. The computer analogy is a good starting point, but it's not perfect. For one thing, computers usually work with clean, structured data, but our brains are dealing with messy, ambiguous info from the world. And then, while computers are great with calculations and following rules, we humans are capable of setting our own goals. And most importantly, we have consciousness, which is a big difference from current AI, as Sternberg points out.
So our brains are much more dynamic and complex. Fascinating. The sources also mentioned artificial intelligence and developmental robotics. How do those tie in?
Well, those fields are actually deeply inspired by our understanding of human information processing. Artificial intelligence, or AI, aims to create systems that can perform tasks that require intelligence when done by humans, essentially replicating some of our cognitive abilities in machines. And developmental robotics uses robots to model and study various aspects of human development, including how we process info. So by trying to build machines that learn like us, it actually gives us new insights into our own cognitive processes. It's a really cool feedback loop of understanding.
It's like reverse engineering the human mind. Now, I remember the sources emphasizing that attention, memory, and thinking aren't isolated processes. How exactly do they all interact?
You're absolutely right. They're all interconnected. Nikitin and Freund really highlight how they all work together as part of this larger information processing system. Figure 2 in your sources gives a simplified model, but the reality is much more dynamic, with tons of interactions and feedback loops. For example, what we pay attention to directly impacts what we remember, and the knowledge we already have influences how we interpret new information and think about it.
It's like an intricate dance between all these cognitive functions.
Yeah.
Now, Siegler talked about how our thinking develops. What are the key mechanisms behind those changes?
Well, Siegler identified three main mechanisms: encoding, automaticity, and strategy construction. Encoding, like we mentioned earlier, is how we get information into memory. As we mature, we become more efficient at picking out important information and ignoring distractions. For example, a young child learning their letters might focus on tiny differences between a printed "es" and a cursive "es, but an older child easily recognizes them as the same letter. That's because they've become better at encoding the essential features.
Right, they can filter out the noise and zero in on what matters.
No.
What about automaticity?
Automaticity refers to our ability to do things without really thinking about them. This comes mainly from practice. Think about driving. At first, every action requires your full attention. But over time, many of those actions become automatic, freeing up your mental space to focus on other things. As tasks become more automatic, we do them faster and with less effort.
That makes total sense. It's like once you learn to ride a bike, you never forget. And the third one was strategy construction, right?
Exactly. It's all about creating new ways to process information and solve problems. As we develop, we become more skilled at coming up with and using these strategies. Like, a high school student struggling with a physics problem might break it down into smaller, simpler steps. That kind of active problem solving is a key part of cognitive development.
The sources also mention self-modification and metacognition. What role do those play in our development?
Well, Siegler suggests that a big part of cognitive development is self-modification, which basically means using what you've learned in new situations. And metacognition, which Flavel described as thinking about thinking, is essential for that. It's like having awareness of your own mental processes. So, for example, a student who knows they learn best through visual aids is using metacognitive knowledge to guide their study strategies. And that's a form of self-modification.
So we're not just learning new things, we're getting better at understanding how we learn. And the sources mention something called the microgenetic approach. How does that fit in?
Yeah, the microgenetic approach supports this idea of constant change. It shows that cognitive development isn't always a smooth upward climb. It often involves trying different approaches, making adjustments, and gradually refining our strategies. So it's more of a dynamic process with lots of ups and downs, even over short periods.
Now, we talked about the speed of processing as a factor earlier.
Yeah.
How does that develop over our lifespan?
The speed at which we can process information is a really basic but fundamental aspect of cognition. It impacts a lot of other cognitive abilities. Think about how quickly you have to react in a video game or when driving. Even in infancy, processing speed matters. Cuevas and Bell found that infants who processed info faster at just 5 months old actually ended up with better cognitive skills when they were preschoolers. So it shows how important this basic ability is from the very beginning.
That's wild. How do researchers even measure processing speed in babies that young?
They use all sorts of clever techniques. Often it involves observing how quickly babies respond to different things they see or hear. For older kids and adults, they might use reaction time tasks, like seeing how fast someone can press a button when they see a certain image, or they might have people match symbols or numbers as quickly as possible.
Interesting. So how does processing speed typically change as we get older?
As you might expect, there's a huge increase in processing speed all throughout childhood and into early adolescence. Hale found that 10-year-olds were much slower at certain cognitive tasks than young adults, but by age 15, their speed was almost the same. And Cale's research actually suggests that improvements in processing speed happen even before gains in working memory, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. You have to be able to process information quickly to hold it in your working memory.
So it's a foundation for a lot of other skills that are developing during those crucial learning years.
Absolutely. Jacobson and others even found a link between faster processing speed and better reading fluency in elementary and middle school kids.
Makes sense. But I also read that processing speed tends to slow down as we age. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. Research by Salthouse, which is often depicted visually in Figure 3, indicates that processing speed usually peaks in early adulthood and then gradually slows down, especially in older age. And this can have real-world consequences. For example, Ross and others have studied how slower processing speed can impact older drivers. Mitchell even found a higher rate of intersection accidents among older drivers, and Hada's research has linked cognitive impairment and slower processing speed to more difficulty driving safely.
That makes sense, especially as driving requires quick reactions. But is it all downhill for processing speed as we get older?
Not necessarily. Saltas himself points out that for many tasks, especially everyday things, raw speed isn't always the most important factor. Plus, as we age, we accumulate knowledge and develop strategies that can help compensate for some of that age-related slowing in processing speed.
Okay, so it's not a simple decline. There are other factors involved. Well, that was a great breakdown of information processing in general. Let's shift gears and focus on attention. How would you define attention, and how does it develop over time?
Attention is really fascinating. There are so many different facets to it. Shimamura, for example, defines attention as the ability to allocate cognitive resources selectively. It's how we decide what to focus on, what's important, and what we can safely ignore. But it's also important to remember that our attentional capacity is limited. We can't focus on everything at once.
Right, it's like the spotlight that we shine on certain things. And there are different kinds of attention, aren't there?
That's right. Psychologists have identified a few key types. Selective attention is the ability to hone in on what's relevant and tune out everything else. Think about trying to study in a noisy environment. You have to filter out all those distracting sounds.
I definitely know that struggle.
Ah!
What are the other types?
So there's divided attention, which is like juggling multiple tasks at once, for example, listening to a lecture while taking notes. Then there's sustained attention, or vigilance, which is the ability to stay focused on something for a long time. This is really important for tasks that require monitoring, like air traffic control.
Okay, that one definitely requires intense focus.
And lastly, we have executive attention, which involves more higher-level cognitive processes, things like planning, setting goals, monitoring your progress, and adapting to new situations.
So executive attention is like the CEO of the brain.
Exactly. And, even babies show some basic attentional abilities from a very young age. They might fixate on edges and contours when they're newborns, and as they get older, they start to scan patterns more systematically.
It's amazing how early these abilities start to emerge.
Right. And by around 4 months old, infants start to develop selective attention, showing a preference for certain things over others. There was a really cool study by Kidd and others that found that babies around 7 or 8 months old actually prefer to look at things that are moderately complex, so not too simple, not too overwhelming.
So they're already looking for that Goldilocks level of stimulation.
Exactly. And a baby's attention is really driven by novelty. When they see something new, it totally captures their attention. But as they get used to it, they start to habituate and their attention fades.
Makes sense. They're like, been there, done that.
Right. And researchers actually use this process of habituation to study what infants can perceive and remember. If a baby stops responding to something familiar, but then perks up when they see something new, it means they can tell the difference.
That's so clever. It's like they're using the baby's own natural curiosity to figure out what's going on in their minds. The sources also mentioned something called joint attention. What is that exactly?
Joint attention is a really important social and cognitive skill. It's basically when 2 or more people are focusing on the same thing and they're aware of each other's focus. It requires being able to track another person's gaze, to direct their attention, and to engage in back and forth interactions. So it's much more than just looking at the same object. There's this shared awareness happening.
Right, like you're not just both staring at a ball, you're both aware that you're sharing that experience of looking at the ball.
Exactly. Researchers like Suarez Rivera and others have studied this extensively, and we know that there are some early precursors, but joint attention really starts to develop towards the end of the first year.
Wow, so even before they can really talk, babies are starting to engage in these complex social interactions.
Yes, and it has huge implications for their development. Think about it. When a parent points at something and says, "Look, a ball," while the baby is also looking at it, that creates such a powerful context for learning language.
It's like a shared world of meaning is being created.
Precisely. And studies have shown that babies who engage in more joint attention actually tend to say their first words earlier and develop larger vocabularies. It also plays a role in developing sustained attention, memory, self-regulation, and even executive function.
So it's a foundational skill that lays the groundwork for so much else. Now, what about changes in attention as we go through childhood and adolescence? What happens there?
Well, we see a lot of progress during the preschool years, as documented by Posner and others. Toddlers have those notoriously short attention spans, but preschoolers can actually sit and focus on things like a TV show for much longer periods.
That's a relief for parents everywhere.
Definitely. However, there is some research, like a study by Swing and others, that suggests a possible link between too much screen time and attention problems, so it's something to be mindful of. But overall, we see significant improvements in executive and sustained attention during the preschool years. Rueda and Posner's research showed that the biggest jump in sustained attention actually happens during this time. And Rothbart and Gartstein explained that these improvements are partly driven by advances in language and comprehension, which helps children understand instructions and stay focused for longer stretches.
So as their language skills improve, their attention skills also benefit.
Exactly. And they also develop better planning skills, which is part of executive attention. This was shown in Verpillo's classic study, where young children had to compare two pictures to find differences. The preschoolers tended to scan randomly, but elementary school kids were much more systematic.
They had a plan of attack.
Right. And some educational programs actually incorporate activities specifically designed to boost attention in young children. These might include games that involve sustained eye contact or listening carefully to follow instructions.
That makes sense. So it's not just something that develops naturally. It's something we can actively nurture.
Exactly. And, having good attention skills is a huge part of being ready for school. Rothbart really emphasized this link. The large-scale NICHD study even found that a child's sustained attention at 54 months old was a strong predictor of how well they did in school later on. And Raza and colleagues found that kids who had better attention at age 5 tended to have higher academic achievement at age 9. So it's a pretty important skill to develop early on.
Absolutely. What about attention in adulthood? Does it change much as we get older?
There is some research suggesting that older adults may experience a decline in certain types of attention, especially when tasks get more demanding or there are a lot of distractions. Studies by Loaiza and Souza and Kramer and Madden have shown this. But for simpler tasks or things that are well practiced, the differences between age groups are often minimal.
So it's not necessarily a drastic decline. It depends on the situation.
Right. And there's actually promising research showing that certain interventions can help older adults maintain or even improve their attention skills. For example, the Lumosity program, which uses cognitive training exercises, has shown some positive results. And studies on yoga and mindfulness meditation have also shown benefits for attention and information processing speed. So it's not a lost cause. There are things we can do to stay sharp as we age.
Okay, that's really encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground with attention. Let's move on to another fascinating topic, memory. How would you define memory in its most basic sense?
At its core, memory is our ability to hold on to information over time. It allows us to learn from our experiences, build relationships, and navigate the world around us. It's what gives us a sense of continuity in our lives. Without memory, we'd essentially be starting from scratch every moment.
It's the foundation of who we are, in a sense. And what are the key processes involved in how we remember things?
There are three main processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is how we get information into our memory system in the first place. It's like taking a mental snapshot of something.
Okay, so encoding is step one.
Right. Then there's storage, which is how we hold on to that information for varying amounts of time. It's like saving that mental snapshot to your hard drive. And then there's retrieval, which is how we access and bring back those stored memories when we need them. It's like opening up that saved file.
It's amazing how much our brains are like computers in that sense. But the sources also pointed out that memory isn't just a passive recording of events. What does it mean that memory is constructive?
Right. That's a really important concept. Our memories aren't like video recordings. They're actually actively constructed and reconstructed every time we access them. Researchers like Schachter and others have really emphasized this point.
So it's not just playing back a tape. It's more like creating a story each time.
Exactly. And schema theory provides a useful way to understand this. Schemas are basically our mental frameworks, our organized patterns of thoughts and beliefs. And they can influence how we encode new information, make inferences, and even retrieve memories later on.
So we might unknowingly fill in gaps or alter details to fit our existing schemas. It's like our brains are trying to make sense of everything and create a coherent narrative.
Precisely. And this is one reason why eyewitness testimony can sometimes be unreliable. Our memories can be influenced by our expectations, our biases, and even by things we hear or see after the event.
That's really eye-opening. What about memory in babies? When do we start to see signs of memory development?
Well, even newborns exhibit some very basic forms of memory. Think about habituation, when a baby gets used to a repeated stimulus and stops paying attention. But when we talk about explicit memory, which is the kind of memory we can consciously recall, it starts to emerge later. Most researchers agree that it shows up in the second half of the first year and really takes off during the second year.
So that's when babies start to form more lasting memories of their experiences.
Exactly. Bauer and Fivish have done a lot of research in this area, and their studies show that older infants can remember more details and need fewer cues to recall past events. By about 20 months, some babies can even remember things that happened a year earlier. But these early memories tend to be fragile, except for things like physical skills and habits.
So those early memories are still pretty different from the rich autobiographical memories we have as adults. What's happening in the brain during those early years that supports the development of explicit memory?
Well, there are a couple of key brain regions that are undergoing significant maturation during that time. The hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are especially important. Research by Moley and McGuire highlights how the development of these areas, particularly between 6 and 12 months of age, lays the groundwork for explicit memory. As these areas continue to mature and form connections with other brain regions, we see big improvements in conscious memory recall.
It's amazing how much is happening in their little brains.
Yeah.
Now, I've always been curious about infantile amnesia. Why can't we remember much from our first few years of life?
It's a fascinating question, and researchers like Bauer have spent years trying to unravel this mystery. Most adults have very few, if any, memories from before the age of 3. And even memories from around age 3 tend to fade significantly by the time we're 8 or 9 years old. There are a few theories about why this happens. One idea is that those early memories are simply encoded in a way that makes them harder to retrieve later on. Another theory points to the immaturity of those key brain structures we talked about, like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. They simply haven't developed enough to form and store long-lasting memories in those early years. So it's like our memory system isn't fully online yet.
It's like our brains are still under construction.
Yeah.
So what kind of memory developments do we see in children as they move past that stage of infantile amnesia?
Well, their memory abilities just take off after infancy, as Fines Clinton and colleagues have noted. We see major improvements in both short-term and long-term memory capacity, and they start to develop and use different strategies to help them remember things better.
So they're getting more tools in their mental toolbox.
Exactly, and they're becoming more sophisticated in how they use those tools.
What about the development of short-term and working memory in childhood? How do those change?
Okay, so first, it's helpful to distinguish between long-term memory and short-term memory. Long-term memory is like our vast storehouse of knowledge and experiences. It has basically unlimited capacity. Short-term memory, on the other hand, is more like a temporary holding space. It can only hold a limited amount of information for a short period, usually up to about 30 seconds without rehearsal.
So short-term memory is like a mental sticky note.
Yeah, a good analogy. And there's a classic test called the memory span task where people have to remember a list of items, like digits, right after they hear them. And Dempster's research shows a clear pattern memory span increases as kids get older. So little kids might only be able to remember 2 or 3 digits, but by age 7, it bumps up to about 5.
Makes sense. The more they develop, the more they can hold in their minds.
Right. And things like processing speed and rehearsal strategies also play a role. Now, working memory is a bit different. It's more like a mental workbench where we actively manipulate and process information. Baddeley's model, which you can see in Figure 10, is really influential in this area. Working memory is essential for things like language comprehension, problem solving, and even learning a new language.
So it's like the engine that drives a lot of our thinking.
Exactly. And working memory develops gradually throughout childhood. Even 8-year-olds only have about half the working memory capacity of an adult. So it takes time to build up that mental stamina.
Now, what about long-term memory for personal experiences? How does that develop in children?
That's where autobiographical memory comes in. It's our memory for the events and experiences that make up our life story. And during the preschool years, kids' memories become increasingly autobiographical. They start to include more details about when and where things happened, and their descriptions become richer. Bauer and Fivish have done some really fascinating research in this area.
So they're starting to create those detailed narratives that we associate with personal memories.
Right. And even though these early autobiographical memories can sometimes seem a bit fragmented, kids can actually remember a lot of detail if you give them the right cues.
Like if you ask them specific questions about the event.
Exactly. And research by Ross and others has even suggested a connection between the richness of our autobiographical memories and our sense of self. The more detailed and coherent our memories are, the better we understand who we are.
That's a really interesting link.
As kids grow into middle and late childhood, their autobiographical narratives become even more elaborate and organized. And things like how parents reminisce with their kids and even cultural differences play a role, as shown by Faivush and Della Mata and Nelson.
So it's not just about brain development, it's also about the social and cultural influences that shape how we remember our lives. The sources also touched on something pretty serious, children's eyewitness testimony. What are some of the key findings from the research in that area?
Eyewitness testimony, especially from children, is a really complex and sensitive issue. There's a lot of research on how accurate children's memories are and how they can be influenced by things like suggestive questioning. Researchers like Bruck and Cece have done a lot of important work in this area.
It's a crucial issue, especially in legal context.
Absolutely. One of the key findings is that preschoolers are particularly susceptible to suggestion. They're more likely to be swayed by leading questions or misleading information, and this can actually distort their memories, as shown by Getty and Alexander. And the way children are interviewed can also have a huge impact on what they remember, as Malloy and others have demonstrated.
So the interviewer's techniques can really affect the child's recollection of events.
Exactly. Now, while it's possible for children to make false claims, research also shows that they can be very accurate witnesses if they're interviewed properly. If the interviewer uses a neutral tone, avoids leading questions, and provides support, children can recall a lot of detail. Goodman and colleagues found this in their research. Savitz and others have also shown that supportive interviewing techniques can actually increase the accuracy of children's recall.
So it's not just about whether children can be trusted, it's about how we gather information from them.
Exactly. The reliability of a child's testimony really depends on the skills and biases of the interviewer, as Ahern, Andrews, and Cece have concluded. So it's a very nuanced issue. It's not as simple as saying children are always unreliable witnesses or that they're always accurate. It depends heavily on how they're treated and how the information is gathered.
Okay, that's a really important point. What about the strategies that children use to try and improve their memory? Do they develop any techniques as they get older?
Yes, absolutely. We call those memory strategies. They're the mental activities we use to help us encode, store, and retrieve information. And as kids get older, they become better at using these strategies. For example, rehearsal, like repeating information over and over, can be helpful for remembering things in the short term.
Like when you're trying to remember a phone number.
Exactly. But for long-term memory, strategies like organization, elaboration, and making information personally relevant are more effective. And preschoolers don't really use these strategies spontaneously, as Flavel found, but older kids start to use them more and more.
So it's a gradual development of becoming more strategic about how they remember things.
Right. And research by Schneider has shown that mental imagery is also a helpful memory aid, especially for older children. Another interesting strategy is elaboration, which involves processing information more deeply, making connections, and generating examples. Adolescents tend to use elaboration more spontaneously, but even younger kids can be taught how to do it effectively.
I remember the sources mentioning something called fuzzy trace theory. What's that all about?
Yeah, fuzzy trace theory is a fascinating idea. It was proposed by Brainerd and Reyna, and it suggests that we actually create two types of memory representations: verbatim traces and gist traces. Verbatim traces are like detailed snapshots. They capture the exact details of the information. Gist traces, on the other hand, are more about the general meaning, the fuzzy gist of what happened.
So it's like the difference between remembering the exact words someone said versus remembering the overall message.
Exactly. And the theory suggests that young children rely more on those verbatim traces, but as we get older, we shift more towards gist-based processing. And that's thought to be one reason why our memories become less about specific details and more about the overall meaning as we mature.
That makes sense. It's like our memories become more conceptual and less about the nitty-gritty details. And I remember the sources really emphasizing how important our existing knowledge is for learning and remembering new information.
Absolutely. Erickson and others have shown that our prior knowledge in a particular area is like a foundation for new learning. It affects what we pay attention to, how we organize new information, and how we interpret it. And ultimately, it affects how well we can remember and use that information later on.
So the more we know about something, the easier it is to learn even more about it.
Right. And a classic study by Chi with child chess experts really illustrates this. These kids, despite being younger than adult novices, could remember the positions of way more chess pieces on a board because they had so much knowledge about chess. They could chunk the pieces into meaningful patterns based on their understanding of the game.
That's impressive. They were leveraging their expertise to boost their memory. What are some practical implications of all this research for educators? Are there specific teaching strategies that can help students learn and remember better?
Definitely. A lot of the research points to the importance of focusing on understanding rather than just rote memorization. Bauer recommends repeating information with variations and making connections to what students already know. And studies by Ornstein and others have shown that teachers who use memory-relevant language in their instruction can really help their students, especially those who struggle more with learning.
So it's about creating a learning environment that supports deep understanding.
Right, and encouraging students to organize information, make connections, and use visual imagery can also be really effective. It's about giving them the tools and strategies to become more active learners.
What about how memory changes in adulthood? Does it stay pretty much the same, or do we see declines as we get older?
Well, as with many cognitive functions, we do see some changes in memory as we age. Working memory capacity tends to decline, and that's partly due to changes in how well we can inhibit distractions and manage multiple pieces of information. Research by Lopez-Hedges and Reuter-Lorenz and Lustig supports this. And of course, as we talked about earlier, processing speed and attention also decline, and those factors contribute to changes in working memory, as Salthouse and Jarjat have found.
So it's like a cascade of effects.
Yeah, in a way. But there's also good news. Research shows that we can actually improve working memory through training, exercise, and even things like imagery techniques. Our brains retain some plasticity, meaning they can still change and adapt, although those improvements might not be as dramatic in older adults as Rhodes and Katz have found.
So there's still hope for keeping our minds sharp as we age. What about long-term memory? Does that decline as well?
Well, it's a bit complicated. Some types of long-term memory are more affected than others. Episodic memory, which is our memory for specific events and experiences, often declines with age. This has been shown in studies by James, Siegel and Castell, and Zhang, among others. And interestingly, those declines in episodic memory can sometimes be an early sign of dementia, as suggested by Borax-Beck's research. But there's also research showing that things like mindfulness training can help boost episodic memory in older adults.
So there are things we can do to stay mentally active and protect our memories.
Right. Now, semantic memory, which is our general knowledge about the world, tends to hold up better over time. We might experience more tip-of-the-tongue moments, but overall, our knowledge base remains relatively stable.
So it's not a uniform decline across all types of memory. That's good to know.
Right, and there's this really interesting phenomenon called the reminiscence bump, where older adults tend to have more vivid memories from their adolescence and young adulthood. It's like a peak period for forming strong, lasting memories. And it especially holds true for positive and self-defining events.
That makes sense. Those are often the years when we're forming our identities and having those formative experiences. What about other types of memory, like source memory and prospective memory?
Source memory, which is our ability to remember where we learned something, often declines with age. And perspective memory, which is remembering to do things in the future, also tends to show some age-related changes. But that's a really complex area, and it depends a lot on the type of task and other individual factors. For example, time-based perspective memory tasks, like remembering to take medication at a certain time, seem to be more affected by aging than event-based tasks, like remembering to give someone a message when you see them.
It's like our internal calendar isn't quite as reliable as it used to be.
In a way, yes, but